All right, hi. I am Jesse Levinson. I've known Marc Levoy for about a decade. Took a couple classes with him when I started my PhD at Stanford, and got to be friends with him. I TA'd his CS 178 class at Stanford with him all 6 years that he taught it. So I had a small role in shaping the course. And whoops, somehow this is doing all kinds of stuff. Okay. Anyway, so he's always invited me to give this lecture during the class on night photography and astrophotography. So he asked me if I would be willing to do the same thing for you guys, and I said happily. He also warned me that you guys are probably smarter than I am and know everything already, so hopefully that's the case. Please feel free to interrupt me and ask me anything during this. He said I had sort of 30 to 35 minutes, so hopefully I'll stay roughly on track. It'd be nice if that thing goes away. Can we get rid of this? There we go. No. Okay, well that's annoying. There it's gone. Okay, excellent. So I'm gonna. Okay, does anybody know how to get rid of this stupid thing? Anybody? No.
I think if you just simply leave the mouse.
Okay. All right. It'll just keep. Okay. All right. So so night photography is pretty different from regular photography for a few reasons. Mainly because there isn't a lot of light, and Marc mentioned that he went over the first half of the noise lecture with you guys last time, so you'll understand a little bit about why that's hard. But we can talk some more about it. Really, the two issues are noise and blur, right? So if you don't capture enough photons, you're going to get a noisy image, and if you do capture enough photons, but things are moving, either you or your camera or your subject, it's going to be blurry. These are bigger problems at night than they are normally. There's also much more dynamic range in many outdoor scenes at night than there is in the daytime, and we'll talk about that too. It turns out that framing is kind of difficult when it's really, really dark. You can't see through your viewfinder or your LCD preview. And it's also not obvious how the photo is going to look. So we're going to try to talk about how you can deal with all of these things. Before we start, I'm curious, raise your hand if you've ever taken a picture that has an exposure of longer than 10 seconds. Can we? Thank you. Sorry, so try that again. Longer than 10 seconds. Excellent. How about longer than 30 seconds, which is the maximum that most. Okay, wow. This is good. Anybody else want to teach this for me? Because I don't think you guys need this lecture, but that's okay. No, I think I'll still give you a few interesting tips. Anybody taking exposure longer than an hour? One person. Two. Okay, good. So let's talk about some tips. Mainly what I'm going to do, by the way, is I'm going to actually go through a whole bunch of night and astrophotography that I've done and talk about some of the challenges and how I dealt with it. But we'll learn some tips along the way. So some of these sound kind of obvious, but some of them are not. If you don't have a tripod, which is usually the case, unless you're specifically going somewhere for the purpose of doing night photography, which is great. But if you don't, you can find a ledge almost all the time. Now, obviously, that restricts the types of angles you can get, but you'll find that the vast majority of time, if you do want to take a picture at night, if you're out in the city, you can usually find a ledge or something to put your camera on, and you can get by. I'll give you a bunch of examples of that in this talk. Using the 2-second self-timer to minimize shake. Raise your hand if you've ever done that for a night photo. All right, good. So everybody knows that. It turns out that when you actually press the shutter button, that in itself moves the camera quite a bit. If your exposure is long enough, like many, many minutes, it probably doesn't really matter. And if it's short enough, like a tiny fraction of a second, it also doesn't matter. But if you're taking pictures that are, a decent chunk of a second or many seconds, just pressing the physical shutter button is definitely going to add motion blur to your scene. So just use the 2-second self-timer. Checking your histogram, right? I assume everybody knows what a histogram is now, so I'm not even going to ask. But it gives you basically a graph that says for every intensity value, for simplicity, probably 8 bits, so between 0 and 255, how many of those pixels are in the scene, right? And it turns out that when you look at the preview on your LCD, it's very confusing at night because everything is dark. So I've seen so many examples of people taking an image at night, and they look at it on their LCD screen and they're like, I nailed it. And they get home and they're like, oh my god, it's like 3 stops underexposed. And the reason is that everything's dark, so you look at your LCD and even an image that's 3 stops underexposed, in the preview, looks super good. So what you really have to do is you really have to look at your histogram and make sure it's not like way to the left. because if it is, then you probably have an underexposed image, which of course you can try to fix in Photoshop or whatever, but then it's going to be extra noisy that you probably didn't need. So always look at your histogram, make sure it's a histogram that you're happy with, and don't believe your eyes when you look at the preview. And you should all know this, but turn off your image stabilization on your lens or your camera if you're taking a long exposure that's not being handheld. More modern versions of image stabilization attempt to realize if they're not being handheld and they'll try to turn themselves off, but that doesn't always work. So just to be safe, turn off IS. All right, so we're going to go through a bunch of photos from different times of day that are close to night and then night, and then just talk about some of these images. So Twilight is a really, really good time to do photography. Basically, it's when you have a combination of natural light and artificial light, where they kind of balance themselves out, right? If you take a picture in the daytime, then the artificial light is kind of not a very significant portion of your scene usually because the sun is so much brighter. If you take a picture actually at night, then there's no natural light, right? And so this twilight is kind of a magical time where you can get a very interesting mixture of both, right? So this is a very northern California coast, and what you see here is a little lighthouse. And what's nice about this photo is you can actually see the light, much brighter than it would be if it was daytime. You also get a little bit of motion blur on the water. It's a 4-second exposure, right? Now, of course, if I had waited another 15 minutes, then you would have had and I had compensated with the exposure. You'd have an extremely bright lighthouse, and then everything else would either be darker, or if you tried to make it just as bright, then your light would just be blinding. So there's, again, sort of a narrow window where you can get a nice mixture of the two. This is from the top of Mauna Kea in Hawaii, looking over the clouds. Again, 2-second exposure. So it turns out that the sky does some very interesting things after we tend to think as humans that the sunset is kind of gone. It gets so dim that we can see there's a little bit of color, but it doesn't really look amazing anymore. But sometimes it is pretty amazing. So again, 2-second exposure above the clouds. Very, very pretty. By this time of day, again, the sunset had sort of gone away, so it didn't look that great to the eye, but all the color is still there if you can do a long exposure. Again, here, mixture of artificial light and what's left of the daylight. Anybody know where this is? Yes. You guys are much smarter than Stanford students. It's disconcerting. Yes, this is the Antonium in Brussels. So again, you have the moon there. This is a very, very wide angle 12mm lens. Again, you can see the artificial lights reflecting in those balls. If I had taken it later, the sky wouldn't be very blue. If I had taken it earlier, you wouldn't get those nice reflections of the artificial lights. Sometimes it's fun to just leave your shutter open and do random stuff. This is on a golf cart. I just left the shutter open for 15 seconds so you can get some kind of interesting abstract art looking things that way. Another example of one of these sunsets that would basically gone away, but with a long 1-second exposure, there's actually a lot there. This is, anybody know where this is? Guesses? Tokyo. So again, this is handheld, so this is interesting. You can see a little bit of motion blur here. It's hard to take handheld pictures with motion blur, but it turns out that at 12mm you can kind of do that. You guys all know the sort of 1/f rule of thumb, right? So sort of what is the longest shutter speed that you should be allowed to get away with hand-holding your picture without motion blur? It's 1 over your focal length if you're in 35mm land. Otherwise you can convert. So this was a full frame camera, so I have a 12mm lens, so I should be able to get away with a 12-second exposure. Now actually this is a 1/4 second exposure. It is actually sharp, of course you can't really tell on this resolution, but it is pretty sharp if you zoom in. So am I just really, really good at hand holding, or did I get lucky? Well, I think Mark has probably told you about what he calls lucky imaging, but basically if you are using a shutter speed in your handheld and it's a little bit past what you think you can get away with, a really, really easy thing to do is just take a whole bunch of pictures, right? So I just took this picture like 10 times, and guess what? You're not paying for film, so who cares, right? So just stand there, take the exact same picture 10 times. You'll waste 3 seconds of your life, right? If you can shoot at 3 frames a second, or maybe 5 seconds of your life if you have a slower camera, and you'll waste a couple pennies of SD space. And then the probability of getting a sharp image goes up massively. Of course, this only works so far. If I had tried to do 1-second exposures, every single one of them would have been blurry, right? But if you're at like 2 or 3x what that 1/f rule says, and you take 5 or 10 images, there's an extremely, extremely high probability that you will get a good one. So that is a good tip to use in general. Anybody know where this is? I hope so. All right, so this is our lovely San Francisco. So this is an interesting one because I shot this out of a hotel room window. So that presents a bunch of challenges. There's a lot of internal reflections in the glass, and worse, if there's any lights on in the hotel room and you're taking a night shot, it's just going to bounce around and you get all these terrible reflections. And you'll notice that you almost can't tell that this is taken out of a window. So what did I do? Well, I took the camera and the lens and I pushed it right up against the glass. Okay. Now there's still, because there's a wide angle lens, this is the Canon 14mm, there's still sort of holes in the lens hood, so some light was still getting through. So what I do oftentimes, if I'm trying to take a picture out of a window of a building and there's interesting stuff, and this works in the daytime too, but it's even more important at night, is take your sweatshirt or some jacket or something and just sort of wrap it around your camera and your lens and just sort of push it way up against the glass. And that way no light is getting in from the room, and you can take a picture out a window that actually kind of looks like there wasn't a window. So it's a little bit of a pain in the butt, but you can probably set it up in about 30 seconds, and it will make a massive difference. I didn't show this sort of before and after here, but I think you all know if you try to take a picture out a window, you usually end up with crap because it's just reflections of all the other things that are going on. And again, this is a 30-second exposure. So this was sort of the very end of Twilight, but you can see that the sky is actually still pretty. The clouds are a little bit pink, the sky's a little bit blue. Again, probably a more interesting shot than if I had taken it 15 or 20 minutes later, and the blue would have been completely gone. This is New York. Got to sneak up to the roof of some building after an investor meeting. And again, did not have a tripod on me because I was not there for the purpose of doing night photography. So I just happened to have my camera on me, but I was not planning on doing night photography. I didn't know I was going to have this opportunity. So went up to this building, of course no tripod, so how are you supposed to do long exposures? So I basically had to climb over a little fence, which is not incredibly safe, on the 50th floor of whatever this building was. And then there was a nice sort of concrete ledge. So I just kind of carefully rested my camera pointing off the corner of that thing, and then took this image. Now this is not a panorama. Kind of looks like it should be, but it's an 11mm, right? So Canon just about a year ago came out with this amazing 11 to 24mm lens. It's 11mm is the widest rectilinear lens you can buy, period. And it's really cool because this is just one image, which I cropped a little bit so it looks like a panorama, but it's not. And a 50 megapixel camera. So this is really cool. I have a 7-foot wide print of this, and it's perfectly sharp, which is pretty good for one image without a tripod. Again, I also took, it was kind of windy, so again, even though I'm not hand holding, I took 15 of these things, and a few of them came out really sharp. So that is probably one of the more important tips I will give you. Anybody know where this is? Yes, Amsterdam. Again, I'm out with some friends, did not have a tripod, was not mainly there to do night photography, and so 3-second exposure. I was at ISO 1600 because I was sort of walking around and taking pictures. I didn't have really time to take a 30-second exposure because my friends would have left me. So, oh well. Turns out that SLRs are pretty good at ISO 1600. Where is this? No? Yes! Almost got you guys. This is St. Petersburg in Russia. So again, with my extended family here, no tripod, but you can see that there's those sort of concrete ledges on this on that fence. So I just put my camera on one of them, set it up, took a nice shot, and pretty good outcome there. Everybody knows where this is. No need to explain. Again, San Francisco. Now this one's kind of fun because I used a 300mm lens, so you don't see a lot of super telephoto night photography. But what it really does is it really compresses your perspective, right? This is probably not an image that you've seen. You might have seen this as a part of a larger image, but it is kind of fun sometimes to do night photography with a telephoto lens. It's really tricky because you need a very sturdy tripod to do a half-a-second exposure at 300mm. So again, as usual, take a whole bunch of shots. Hopefully one of them will come out. So city panoramas at night. So this is really fun. This one looks great when you have a huge screen, or you can print it. So I've done an 8-foot wide print of this, and it came out really well. So basically, this is from the top of Treasure Island, and there was a abandoned sort of military base, some kind of tower that you used to be able to climb up illegally. Now you can't because they got rid of the staircase, so it's very sad. But this is an amazing view. and the moon is actually there. I sort of figured out when the moon was going to be there. I took this. Again, windy. The first time I did this, I did not follow my own advice, and I figured, okay, it's a panorama. Who has time to take, multiple pictures at each one, right? So I didn't. And I got home. I'm very excited. Looked at the first couple pictures. They're beautiful, perfectly sharp. And I got to the fourth one, and it's just completely blurry because there was a gust of wind. So imagine how frustrating this is. You have this 10-image panorama, right? And like 2 of the 10 images are just super blurry. There's nothing you can do. You're just completely screwed. So I went back, and I was like, okay, not happening again. And I took 5 images, for each one, for each of the 10 angles, and then you just have to just go and pick the sharpest one of each of them. Then you throw them into Photoshop or whatever you're using to stitch, and it's a much better idea. So I learned my lesson there. Again, San Francisco. This is from the Twin Peaks or whatever it's called, by the antenna. Again, 7 images. This is actually more of a twilight shot, so you can see some nice blue sky in there. Again, nice mixture of natural light and artificial light. Take this picture a little bit later, and you actually can't really see most of the buildings. You just see the lights. Take it earlier, and it just sort of boring daytime shot. So good time of day to take pictures. Everybody knows where this is. This was fun. Anybody here used a Gigapan before? Anybody here heard of a Gigapan? Okay. So Gigapan is one of these robotic spherical panoramic tripod heads, which sounds pretty cool. Basically, it's a little mount that you can put your camera in, and it has a actuator, so it can go sort of left to right and up to down. And so you can basically program it. You can say, hey, I want to take a panorama. Here's the top left of the image. Here's the bottom right, and here's my focal length. And you just press a button, and then it actually can connect to your camera and trigger the shutter, and it'll just go ch-ch-ch-ch-ch. It's a little slower than that. It's also kind of flimsy, but it's a cool idea. Kind of a pain in the ass to use. But if it's not super windy, you can get some good results. So this is Oracle, obviously. Amazing thing is this is a 4x13 panorama, right? So you'll never be able to do a 4x13 panorama with a regular tripod. And the reason is that you'll just have a real hell of a time trying to get the overlaps correct, right? You'll probably screw something up. I mean, you could do it, but it would be very, very time consuming and very annoying to stitch. So the cool thing with the Gigapan is it just sort of lines them all up for you, so they just all fit into place like puzzle pieces. And if you're going to be doing a Gigapan with that many images, you're probably going to want a pretty telephoto lens, even if you want to end up with a wide angle image, obviously, because if you use a wide angle lens, then you're only going to need a few shots. So I use a 135mm lens, which is a relatively telephoto lens. I still ended up with an incredibly large field of view. Now the cool thing about this, because you could say, well, why don't you just use a regular lens and take 3 or 4 images, and it would look the same. And that's true, unless you want to make an absolutely gigantic print, which I think is fun. And so if we zoom in here, we're going to look at the second building. You can barely see that it says Oracle up there. We're going to zoom in here, right? And then there's actually a bird's nest inside the R, which is really cool. You could not see the bird's nest, at least I couldn't see it with my eyes, but I was excited to sort of explore the panorama and discover a very exciting bird's nest inside of the R. So that's pretty cool, right? I mean, like, you can even barely see Oracle on there, and that you can make out a bird's nest. So why do you care? Again, only if you are just a geek and you think it's cool, or if you want to make an absolutely huge print. Personally, I think it's really fun to make huge prints. You don't often see huge prints at nighttime. It's easy to do, but just takes a bunch of time to take all the images and make sure you don't screw anything up. So I highly recommend trying to do night panoramas. Has anybody ever done a night panorama before and printed it? No? Okay. It's very fun. All right. So here is another example with the sort of out of a window trick. So this is, anybody know where this is? It's not Paris. Yeah, it's Tokyo. Right. So they have the little like fake Eiffel Tower thing going on there too. Okay, so this is an HDR image, right? So if I had taken it earlier in the day, I could have gotten away with that nice sort of twilight effect, where there's a nice balance of natural and artificial light. But I happened to be there at like 2 in the morning, so couldn't do that. So if you take one image, basically you have a choice between totally blowing out the highlights or having everything else be black. So I did 3 images, a 1 second, 4 second, and 30 second, pushed the camera and the lens against the glass wall, and did this trick where you wrap the sweater around the thing. And so you basically got rid of all the reflections. And again, very wide angle, 12 millimeter lens there. and it came out really well. Now, of course, it's not a panorama, so I can't make a wall-size print of it, but it was still a very, very sharp image, and you could make a normal-size print of it, or it makes a very nice desktop picture. Another time of day that's fun is early morning. I don't think I've ever woken up for early morning, but I have sometimes still been awake for it. So the first time I got into photography was when I was an undergrad, and I was over at Princeton, and it was 2003, and it was the first time you could buy a digital SLR without spending a preposterous amount of money. So the Canon 10D came out for $1,500, which now is pretty expensive for an SLR, but at the time was ridiculously cheap. It was like half the price of the thing 6 months earlier. So I got one and sort of would just stay up all night playing with it. So this is kind of fun because it sort of doesn't look like a really long exposure, but it's actually a 7-minute exposure, right? Doesn't look obvious, but one of the things that's kind of cool about it is you see the sort of mist going on, right? So if you had waited until it was lighter, you wouldn't get that cool mist effect. Okay, now this is a fun photo. Who knows what's going on in this photo? What are we looking at here? Eclipse. Very good. So that is the sun during a solar eclipse, as seen from Tahiti. And it's really, really cool because you get this amazing sort of iridescent thing going on in the clouds through some crazy diffraction thing that I don't completely understand. But there was a physicist on the trip, and he thought it was really cool, so he decided to put it in his physics textbook. But yeah, so it looks like the moon because you have the little crescent, but of course it's the moon covering up the sun. And we were very annoyed that they were clouds because you wanted to actually see the eclipse. Fortunately, the clouds disappeared during totality, so we got sort of the best of both worlds. But this is really cool because you get the sort of corpuscular rays coming out, and then this crazy like rainbow thing, shimmery thing going on in the clouds, which you very rarely see in real life. This is obviously a fisheye lens. This is in Hawaii. Again, 2-minute exposure, a little bit of artificial light, but mostly not, and a bunch of stars. We're going to start talking a little bit more about stars in the second half of this talk. But you can see that there's not really too many star trails here. That's because we use an extremely wide-angle lens, right? So obviously the sort of wider angle of your lens, the less amount of star trails you're going to see for a given exposure. This is fun because there's a rainbow, but it's nighttime, right? So that's actually caused from the moon and not the sun. People call that moonbow, which doesn't really make sense because you don't call rainbows sunbows. So I don't know why it's called moonbow, but apparently it's called a moonbow. So this is in Yosemite, a waterfall, and this is one of the first long exposures I ever took, about 11 or 12 years ago now, and it is an 8-minute exposure, so you get a little bit of star trails. And it's not even that great of a picture, but it was really cool because back then it was very hard to take long exposures. You could do it with film, but then there's this thing called reciprocity failure. Who's heard of that? All right. So if you used to shoot film, you know that unfortunately when you start taking long exposures with film, you don't get sort of twice the exposure with twice the exposure time because film just is not friendly with those things, whereas digital cameras are very amenable. So it was actually hard to take pictures like this before digital cameras came out. Not to mention the fact that film was just incredibly noisy, so you could hardly do this kind of stuff. Same night, did a 4-image panorama. Again, 3-minute exposures per image. This one's kind of fun. So this is a 6-minute exposure in Lake Tahoe, and I kind of liked it because it was kind of cloudy, so it almost looks like it's raining. Of course, those are just star trails, but it's kind of an interesting effect. And this was the ground is lit up. It's snowing, of course. Well, it had snowed, but it was kind of fun because there was actually street lights behind me, which is why the ground was kind of lit up. And then there's this nice little like enclave back there with some other lights, so you could see the trees kind of lit up. That was kind of fun. This is the same night. I wanted to also take a picture without star trails. So again, you have to be pretty fast on the exposure. So this is only 13 seconds. You notice this was ISO 400. Here I jacked it up to ISO 1600. It was still really underexposed, so I had to boost it like another 2.5 stops in Adobe Camera Raw. This one is from Aptos, California. I was incredibly lucky. I've been talking about how to avoid wind, but clearly there was just none. This is a 12-minute exposure. So imagine how still it had to be to take this picture for 12 minutes, and there's almost no motion blur. I didn't realize it was that still when I took the picture, but then I saw the preview on the LCD and I was like, holy crap, how did that happen? So again, you actually do get some star trails there. You get to see the city lights. And reasonable composition. Again, it was incredibly dark. You can imagine it must have been very dark because that's a 12-minute exposure. So I wasn't really sure how this was going to turn out, but I was pretty happy with it. Then I have a few pictures from the Stanford dish area, which you are definitely not allowed to be at after sunset, so may or may not have climbed over a fence to do that. It's very, very pretty up there. I, of course, don't recommend it. But if you do find yourself up there, definitely bring a tripod. This is kind of fun. My friend spotted a deer, and he's like, quick, take a photo. So I just like turned my camera around and had no idea what any of the settings were and pressed the button, and definitely came out really nicely. It looks like I put a lot of thought into this composition, you know? Like the deer is like right under that nice little sort of thing. Just complete luck, no skill whatsoever, but I'll take it. Or I could have just photoshopped a deer in, but I didn't. It's a real photo. So this is the dish, obviously. Very pretty. I mean, you're sort of foggy, and you see some lights. Not a view you usually get to see because they're closed. This was kind of fun. Anybody ever done a focus stack before? A couple people, right? So basically what you do here is you take two pictures at different focus distances, and then you just sort of Photoshop them together. And I had to do that here because if I focused on the cows, then the dish would have been out of focus. And if I focused on the dish, then the cows would have been focused. And of course, the normal thing to do is you just stop your lens down. I could, okay, let's just take a picture at f11. But you'll notice there's already a 30-second exposure. And I don't think cows eat people, but I wasn't like entirely sure. So I was like, okay, 30 seconds is enough here. So I just took two images at different focuses, and then fortunately, of course, sometimes it's very hard to combine images for different focuses. This one was really easy because it's sort of like, okay, the stuff over here is the cows, stuff over there is the dish, so it was very easy to sort of combine those together. As you can see, the cows are also incredibly still, right? I mean, that's a 30-second exposure. I don't think they had a lot going on during those 30 seconds. Another pretty view again, just sort of a strange image. You don't usually see these types of, like it doesn't even really look like night at first, but then it kind of does because you see the lights, kind of like that. And that's the little dish. So this is kind of fun. Anybody ever done light painting before? Okay, so right, everybody probably knows what that is, but basically the idea is you take a long exposure, and then during the exposure you walk around or shine a flashlight or do something. So this is fun. This was at my sister's wedding in September, and I wanted to take a picture of the groomsmen. And it was in Carmel Valley, so it was a very clear night. So I was like, okay, let's see if we can get a picture of them with the Milky Way. And I didn't have a flash on me, and even if I had a flash, it would not have had the same effect. So what I did here is I set up the tripod. I took a 30-second exposure, and I used ISO 3200 because I wanted to get a nice sharp sky, and I also didn't want people to be moving too much. So what I did was I took my iPhone. I didn't have a flashlight, but I took my iPhone, right? And you can use the little torch, which is pretty bright. And I actually just walked around the scene for 30 seconds while it was taking the picture. So I first shined it on them. Now it's really, you have to try it a few times because the first time I shined it on them for like 5 seconds, and they were just like completely blown out white, everybody. So then it's okay. So then it's like, okay, so I shine it for like maybe 1 second, and then I just sort of walked around the rest of the scene, including going around back there and trying to light everything up. And you can actually see my streak. You see that little trail there? So I was trying to keep the scene evenly illuminated, but as I was walking there, you could actually see my sort of torch pointing right to the camera. So there's that little artifact which I didn't bother to get rid of. But this is pretty cool because I didn't have a flash, and I did have a tripod. Of course, I could have used a ledge if I didn't have a tripod. But you can take pictures like that with very little equipment, which is kind of cool. Okay, so that's night photography. Now let's talk about taking really, really long exposures. So whether it's of scenery or whether it's of astrophotography kind of things in the sky, everything that's hard about taking photos at night gets a lot harder when you're trying to do hour exposures, right? So why does this get hard? Well, for one thing, you don't want to take a 1-hour test shot, right? I mean, that just doesn't work, right? So what can we do? Well, you can take a test exposure at a very high ISO, wide open, and this is not CS178 anymore, but same idea, right? So we've now learned how you can trade off ISO and aperture and exposure, right? So I'll give an example of that. All right, so here, anybody know where this is? Yes, this is Zion National Park. Okay, so I wanted to take a picture with star trails, which of course means a very long exposure, and I didn't want it to be noisy, but I also didn't want to take a 1-hour test shot. So what I did was I used the lens wide open, took a 30-second exposure, and I cranked it all the way up to ISO 6400. It actually looks kind of decent at this size. It looks like shit if you zoom in, but for a preview, it's perfectly fine. And you get a histogram out of the thing, right? So this was maybe the second or third test shot I took. I was just sort of cranking up the ISO until I was pretty happy with the histogram. I figured, okay, if my real picture has that type of histogram, I'll be a happy guy, right? So here's the real picture I took. Of course, you can see all the star trails. Now this one's at ISO 100. It's a 60-minute exposure and it's f6.7. So let's compare these two histograms, right? They're pretty similar. I moved the camera a little bit, so they're not exactly the same, but they're the same sort of general shape, right? So the cool thing is that you can figure out if you go from this exposure to this exposure, well, okay, so I went from 30 seconds to 60 minutes, so that's 120 times more light. On the other hand, I went from ISO 6400 to 100, right? So that's a factor of 64 that I'm losing. Of course, you're not losing the light, but you're losing the brightness. And then I went from f4.5 to f6.7, which is about a factor of 2. So you can see it all kind of cancels out, right? You have 120x divided by 64 divided by 2, right? It's about back to where we started, right? So this is really cool. So I can take this picture. I only waste 30 seconds of my time, and then I do a little bit of math, and I figure out that this exposure is going to come out approximately correctly. Now, of course, you can be off by a stop in either direction. You can fix it in RAW. Obviously, you should be shooting all your night photos in RAW. I shouldn't even need to tell you that. Do not shoot your night photos in JPEG. You definitely want to be able to play with the exposure. It's much harder to nail the exposure at night than it is in the daytime, plus all the other obvious advantages of RAW, like being able to change your white balance and everything else. So this is kind of cool. This is a full hour exposure, so you really get the whole star trail effect. Yes?
Do you use the in-camera dark frame subtraction?
Excellent question. So you used to absolutely have to use in-camera dark frame subtraction if you wanted to get good hour exposures, right? So what is dark frame subtraction, right? So I think Mark went over different sources of noise last time, right? But the main ones are sort of photon shot noise, right? So this is just, if you don't capture very many photons, even if your sensor were completely perfect and you could know exactly how many photons hit every single pixel, you still aren't going to get beautiful noise for images just because of the fact that your photons are arriving in a Poisson distribution. And if it's so dark that you should have on average gotten 1.7 photons in this pixel, then you're going to take a picture, you might get 0, 1, 2, 3, or 4, but there's just no way to know how bright that actually was. So by the time you boost the brightness up, it's just not there, right? And then you have read noise, which is just when you take the picture and then you sort of ask each pixel how many photons did it get. You do the voltage conversion. It lies a little bit, right? And the more it lies, the more noisy your image is. And the good news is read noise has been going down a lot. And the latest Sony sensors have almost no read noise, which is really cool. Which basically means that you can shoot a picture at ISO 100 that's underexposed by 5 stops, and it will be almost as good as if you had just shot it at ISO 3200 in the first place, right? Which is pretty cool. Really, really good for dynamic range. So the last kind of noise, well, there's pattern noise, but the last main kind of noise is thermal noise, right, or dark current noise. So it turns out that when your sensor is warm, or other things around your sensor are warm, some of that heat actually registers as photons when you turn your image into a picture. So this causes things like pink bands and magenta hotspots and all kinds of gross stuff. It used to be really, really, really bad with CCDs. Like if you bought the original Canon 1D, which was their first sort of sports professional SLR, probably came out around 2001 or something. Really great camera, pretty good high ISO, but even a 30-second exposure at night, it would just be like half the picture would just be magenta. It was a disaster. So it turns out that the chips are getting much, much better at not giving you dark current. And in fact, some of the chips now can sort of do some magic where they kind of estimate it on the fly and automatically remove it. So for this image, I actually did not do dark frame subtraction. Other thing to keep in mind is the amount of dark current noise you get is very much related to the temperature outside. It actually doubles with every 7 degrees Celsius. So this is very, very, very cold, right? Because it was like 2 in the morning at a very high altitude. So it was well below freezing here. So good time to take a long exposure without worrying about dark noise. If it had been warm, probably would have had to do dark frame subtraction. So there's 2 ways to do dark frame subtraction. And again, what that is basically you take a picture, right? Just like normal. And then you take another picture with no light coming in. So you put the lens cap on, or the camera does it itself, without letting light in, and then you just subtract the dark frame from the normal frame. And what that does is if there's any sort of systematic noise caused by heat, then the idea is that hopefully that noise will be similar from one frame to the next, and then you can just remove it. And that was really, really helpful back when cameras had pretty crappy sensors. As the sensors are getting better again, it's becoming less and less important. Sometimes you need to do it if it's warm outside, or if you're like having a really underexposed image and you want to boost it. Still very, very helpful. You can also do it. You can also do it yourself. So cameras will generally have a setting that say, do you want to use long exposure noise reduction? That's what they usually call it. That's another way of saying dark frame subtraction. Problem is it doubles your exposure time, right? So if you wanted to do a 1 hour exposure, you have to wait a whole second hour for it to take that dark frame, right? So the other thing you can do is just take the exposure normally, shoot it in RAW, and then some other time, right, you could take another dark frame from the same chip. Hopefully it has similar characteristics. Of course, the temperature might have changed, but you can actually, with sort of astrophotography software, you can actually tell it to delete, that second frame from the first frame. And if you really want to do it accurately, what you should really do is take a whole bunch of dark frames, because if you think about it, your dark frame itself also has noise in it, right? So if you subtract that dark frame, you're also introducing noise. So the best way to do it is you take 50 dark frames sometime when you have you can just leave your camera somewhere, and then you average them all together, and that's sort of your master dark frame, which you can then subtract from your long exposure images. Point is though, most of the time you don't even need to worry about it anymore because the sensors are so good that it's not that big of an issue. Here's a black and white conversion. Now when I went from here to here, what I did, and this is a nice thing to think about in general photography, is when you're turning an image into black and white, the first thing you generally do is you just take the saturation slider and you put it all the way to the left, and then you get a nice grayscale image, which is fine. But it turns out there's many different ways to create a black and white image from a color image, right? Because as you know, your color image has a red channel, a green channel, and a blue channel. And you can use any of those channels or any combination of those channels, including not even positive combinations, to create your black and white image. So when I went from here to here, right, which channel do you think I used most of? Yeah, orange or the red channel, right? So this was interesting, right? Because the rocks are very red, right? And the sky was very blue, right? So if you use the red channel, you get these really cool bright mountain things and a nice dark sky, right? If I had used the blue channel, I would get a very, very bright sky and very dark mountains, which is not the effect I was going for. So in Photoshop, this is called channel mixer. I highly encourage you to play with it. Anytime you want to make a black and white image, you should at least play with those sliders and see what happens, because it's much more interesting than just sort of, if you just drag the saturation slider to 0, it kind of averages them all with a little bit of a bias towards green, which is fine, but it might not be the best possible effect. Same trip here. This is, no, different trip. This is back in Yosemite here. 9 minutes, ISO 400, star trails going on again here. This was kind of annoying because my lens completely fogged up. It was very misty out. But then I kind of decided it was an interesting kind of eerie effect. 67-minute exposure, very, very long, very, very boring exposure, but kind of a neat image. This is the longest exposure I've ever taken, 80 minutes. This is, where is this? Yeah, Bryce Canyon. And again, I'm not showing you, but I had to, of course, do that trick where you do a very, very high ISO, quick exposure, wide open, to get a sense of your histogram, and then you do this. And I was pretty happy with how that came out. The moon, there was like a quarter of a moon, which actually sort of lit up the valley and gave it roughly a similar brightness to the sky. So that came out pretty nicely. Yes?
Why would you take an 80-minute instead of, say, 10?
Great question. Great question. Okay, so there are 2 possible reasons. Anybody want to guess what they are?
You want a longer star trail.
Good. So that's one. I want longer star trails, right? So if I could do 10-minute exposure, but then I would have 12.5% the length of the star trails, and I kind of like the circle effect. Okay, so that's one reason. What's the other reason to do 80 minutes instead of 10? What? Yeah, exactly. So you get 8 times more light, right? So 8 times more light is coming in, which means you're going to have a better signal-to-noise ratio, which means your image is going to be cleaner, right? So there's so great. So then you can say, well, what if you just took 8 images, right? They were each 10 minutes, and you sort of added them up. The answer is, well, you'd have the same number of photons that you captured, but your image would actually be a little bit noisier because you're actually then combining the read noise in each of those 8 images. So you'd end up with an image that was a little bit noisier than this. The other thing that's tricky is if you do take 8 images and there's any gap in your exposure and then you add them together, you get little gaps in your star trails, right? So you basically would have like 8 segments of star trail with tiny, tiny little gaps in them, which would you may or may not be able to notice depending on how quickly you could take the next exposure after the last one. That's a, yeah, of course. Well, okay, so you are averaging it, but again, if you think about it, let's think about the total number of photons that hit our sensor during those 80 minutes, right? So in this picture, it was just the shutter was open the entire 80 minutes, and we got all the photons that hit us in those 80 minutes, right? If instead I had taken 8 10-minute exposures, you would agree that I didn't magically get more photons, right? It's the same total number of photons hitting, right? Well, you can't. No, you can't, because basically the number of photons you're getting has nothing to do with your right photons, right? So number of photons you're getting. I could have used a wider aperture. That's true. But this was a Sigma 12 to 24 millimeter lens, and it's not super sharp wide open. So that's a great question. So why did I stop it down? I stopped it down because there's tremendous vignetting wide open on this lens, and it's not super sharp in the corners. So that's why I used this aperture. But you're right. You can definitely take more shorter exposures and you can average them together, right? But each exposure is going to be darker. So in effect, you're really adding them up. And then really, again, all that's happening is you're just adding a little bit of extra read noise into that pipeline. And so your image is going to end up being probably a little bit noisier. But you can certainly do that. All right, so let's talk about astrophotography. So all the pictures we've looked at so far are sort of pictures of things on Earth, and maybe there's some nice sky in them. Let me just make sure we're okay on time. No, I'm not. I'm going to go quickly now. How are we doing on time? Okay, so let me go really quickly then. I don't want to eat into. Okay, so let me just go through this really quickly. So this is taking photos of things in the sky. You need a tripod and bulb mode. You probably can't get away with 30 seconds here, so you need one of those remote shutter releases. Very, very dark, very hard to focus. You can't probably use autofocus unless it's the moon. It's very cold. If you're doing a long exposure, you need to track the rotation of the Earth, so you have to use a equatorial mount. Has anybody ever done that before? Pretty fun. All the kind of image noise you have to worry about, and light pollution and clouds and atmosphere. So most of the time you try to take night photos, it just completely doesn't work, and that's just something you have to deal with. Right? So tracking, Earth is spinning. Equatorial mounts can compensate for that. You have to sort of polar align them and tell them where you are, although now you can use your iPhone or Android and it kind of figures it out. You can get cheap ones for $100. You can get expensive ones for $1 million. Forklifts, they're pretty cool. I definitely don't have one of those. Rule of thumb, so just like the 1/f rule for handheld photography, for star trails, the rule is 1,000 seconds divided by your focal length. That's the longest exposure you can get without having visible star trails. Now, incidentally, this was back in the days of film when the resolution wasn't that good, so you actually have to be a lot more conservative than this. If you do this, you'll still get several pixels of star trails. Right? Very different scales, tiny things, bigger things, huge things like the entire sky. Here's the moon. This is the recent eclipse from, I think it was October, right? So two images side by side, but the one on the left is a full second exposure at ISO 800. The one on the right is a 500th second at ISO 400, so a factor of 1,000 difference in brightness. Image stacking, we were just sort of talking about that. You can take a whole bunch of images, average them together, definitely reduces your noise compared to only using one of them. And sometimes you have to align the images if things are moving, so you can do that with Photoshop or whatever software you want. Here's an example of a single image of the Milky Way from Hawaii. This is in the winter. Not very good. Here I took 10 images, averaged them together, and then sort of equalized the histogram so that it's a little bit more spread out. And it's very, very pretty. Here's the Andromeda galaxy with a 500mm f2.8 telescope lens. Single image. Here's if you do auto levels to it. Gets brighter, still looks pretty crappy. Here we used 60 images. My dad and I took this in Hawaii. 60 different images averaged together, 3 minutes each. So again, it looks like I've zoomed in. I haven't really zoomed in a tiny bit, but mainly it's just you see way more stuff. Histogram comparison again before and after the sort of equalization. Horsehead Nebula, this is another sort of 60 image stack, pretty cool. Here's the Milky Way from Mauna Kea. There's a panorama with 4 images way back 10 years ago. A little bit noisy, but it was pretty cool. I did a better job a couple of years ago. I went back and used a newer camera, better lens, came out better. Now this is kind of cool because this is a single test shot I was doing to figure out how bright it was. This is one image. There's only 9 seconds. It's ISO 6400. So cameras are getting very good. Sensors are very clean these days. You can take pictures like this. Now, one question is, okay, if we wait 20 years, can I just, take this picture handheld? Maybe the sensors will get better. Can I do that? What do you guys think? No. Not possible. Sounds awesome. Totally not possible. The sensors are so good that, as we were discussing, almost all the noise here is just photon shot noise. There's just not enough photons, right? So even if you had the world's perfect sensor that literally introduced no noise, it would barely look better than this. So it's kind of sad. Our sensors are so good that there's not a lot of room left. And here's the last slide. So this is kind of fun. So here I took a long exposure, 3 minutes. I tracked it so that I didn't get star trails. But of course, if you do that, then your foreground is going to be blurry because you're now rotating against the foreground, which isn't moving. So what I did was I took 2 images, one with tracking and one without tracking, right? And then I just sort of photoshopped them together, which can be a little bit tricky depending on the scene. But this is nice because I was able to get a very nice sharp foreground and a very nice sharp sky. So that is probably too much time. I apologize. Thank you.
No, I don't have one. Does this work?
Yeah.
Let's see.
Crank up the volume in here a little bit.
Nah, I'll try to.
Okay.
Hi, I'm Florian Kainz. I'm in Marc's GCAM, the computational photography group. And I'll talk about trick and effect photography. So unlike Jesse, I haven't done this before, so the talk will not be nearly as polished. So I apologize for that in advance. So can you all hear me? Okay. So for the purpose of this talk, I'll I'll define trick and effect photography as just about any image where you see something that you would not have seen in real life. So it can be a completely imaginary scene like this one, or it can be one that you have just altered slightly to make it look more interesting. So I'll go over some historical examples of manipulated photos. I'll show some uses of current trick and effect photography, and then I'll go over some examples of techniques that you could use. And so hopefully you'll get some ideas for things you might want to try yourself. So historical examples. So of course, pretty soon after photography was invented, people came up with images that looked like they were photographs, but but they were of scenes that never existed in the real world. So the reasons were, well, varied just as today. So some for, well, like this scene with the dog playing cards for a quick laugh, and also to make people wonder how this might have come about. So photography was this new way of making pictures that supposedly was a physical process with no intervention of a painter interpreting a scene. And so, well, how's this possible? So, so other reasons were, well, for making trick photographs or photo montages were convenience, like the family of Emperor Napoleon III. Well, there are 40 people in this picture, I think. And rather than herding them all together in one room, the photographer just stitched together a bunch of photographs that he probably already had, and so this is sometime in the mid 19th century, so pretty soon after photography was invented. So pictures of historic events have also often been manipulated. It's not always clear why this would be the case, but often for to push a political agenda. Not with this one, probably, though. So this is an example that comes from the website of the Library of Congress. So it claims to show General Ulysses Grant at City Point in Virginia in 1864. So it looks like it's a document that of an event in the Civil War. Now, if you look more closely, there are a bunch of things that don't look quite right. So where the head of General Grant joins his body, that seems a little off. Also, if you look at the hooves of the horse, where they fit the ground, there's no shadow. There's also, they have a sharp outline, but both the ground and the hooves themselves are somewhat blurry. And there's other stuff, like Grant at the time, if you're a history buff, he should have had 3 stars on his shoulder straps rather than 1, and the horse isn't his either. And so people at the Library of Congress actually figured out what pictures this was made out of. I think they have all these originals in their archives. And so, turns out that the composite was created some 40 years after the Civil War by a photographer in Washington by the name Levin Corbin Handy, who I think was an apprentice to a 19th century photographer and inherited a large number of negatives from the Civil War and made a living licensing these to news outlets or making prints, and sometimes when it was convenient he came up with new, more heroic ones. Well, the Soviet Union is, of course, famous for altering historic photographs to align the official version of the past with whatever the current ideology was. So this picture was taken in 1897, and it shows Vladimir Lenin and his League for the Struggle of Emancipation of the Working Class. So on the left is the original version, and this is the version that was seen after 1930, when this guy up in the corner, Alexander Malchenko, had been accused of being a saboteur, and he had been executed, and so he was completely obliterated from history, at least for a while. So he was rehabilitated posthumously, and after 1958 he showed back up in newer versions of this photo. So, as with anything new, some enterprising people come up with ways to extract money from gullible victims. And so a guy in Boston named William Mumler claimed he could take pictures of the spirits of deceased people. So you could go there, pay $10 and have us sit for a photograph. And if you were, $10 is around in 1860 is around $200 worth of buying power today, so this wasn't cheap. And so if you were lucky, your deceased husband might show up as a faint ghost in the image. More often than not, he wouldn't show up, and you'd have to come back and try again, and until it worked. So So Mumler at some point was accused of being a fraud, and there was actually a trial, but apparently it wasn't possible to prove that he was actually, they weren't legally able to prove that this was fraudulent, so he got away with it, but apparently the trial ruined his career. So then other more honest photographers, came up with ways to make composite images to as just standalone works of art. The pictorialists were intended to make photos that would take sort of the role of paintings, like this one by Henry Peach Robinson. So this is made up out of 6 separate negatives. So from what I've read, I guess I think Robinson photographed the man sitting at the table, and as he was doing this, he thought of this whole composition, and then, well, after the guy was gone, he arranged to take the pictures of the rest of what goes in there. I don't know why it had to be 6 pictures, because it seems like you could actually just build the whole scene and take the picture as is. So, well, trick and effect photography, of course, didn't go away. This stuff is ubiquitous today. We see it in advertising, magazine covers, architecture visualization. Of course, there's doctored news and false celebrity gossip, what have you. Well, motion pictures, of course, make heavy use of these techniques. And, well, then just as before, we have standalone works of art. So here's a picture that's, well, obviously shot for advertising to sell jewelry. For stuff like this, the elements that go into a composite picture like that are shot with the final picture in mind, and then they are assembled very carefully to come up with something that looks convincing and not ridiculous. But this can be quite expensive. So other people who use who make photo composites are, well, celebrity magazines and stuff, and there it's done to save costs. So Kristen Stewart or whoever might not be available for a photo shoot, or they might not want to sit for a photo shoot for that particular magazine, and anyways it would be expensive and time consuming. So you take a headshot of the actor or actress and a body shot of somebody else entirely and fit it together. And sometimes, most of the time, you don't notice it. In these 2 cases, well, it's pretty obvious. So Andrew Garfield has an impossibly long neck, so clearly his head wasn't where he is. And Kristen Stewart lost her left arm, so as far as I know, she still has it. And so, I mean, it's just probably, I would guess that the legs are somehow added. So, but who knows how this was done? I mean, the seams are easy to hide using Photoshop. So, architecture visualization. Actually, I need to. Yeah. Okay. So, I think I should be fine. So, architecture visualization often uses computer graphics to sell, and combined with a shot of a proposed building site to sell the building to customers and also to the public. So now you have, of course, there's the political stuff, just like in the past. So here's Korean dictator Kim Jong-un being mindful about what's going on in his country, discussing a new building site, except none of these people are casting a shadow, and the on the ground, and the lighting isn't consistent with the background either. And so here's another one. So not produced by the government, by somebody who didn't like the government. So this picture was shot on September 11th, 2001, a few minutes after the World Trade Center had been hit by two airplanes. So at the time, President Bush was in Florida in an elementary school reading books with children, and an aide informed him what had just happened, and he didn't react visibly for a few minutes, and political opponents took that to mean that he had no clue what to do. And so, and to reinforce that, some people doctored this picture to make him hold the book upside down, which of course he wasn't. So, just as in the past, fraud is also a good way, a good use for trick photography. Today it's not spirits, it's aura photography. So the aura is this energy field that emanates from you, tells you something about your health and your mood and whatnot, or influences or something like that. It's kind of like the Force in Star Wars. With digital photography, there's a new twist. You don't just fleece the people who sit for a photograph, but you part the photographer from the money. So here's the AuraCam 6000, which you can buy. but you need this warranty module here. So it contains a powerful memory lattice to ensure that your photos come out accurate. And of course, this module, unfortunately, well, it wears out. So after 500 photos, you have to buy a new one. It costs only $1,000. Well, motion pictures, of course, use trick photography extensively. That's a very large topic, and I won't go into too much detail there, because there you have to deal with moving images, and there are unique challenges to that. But anyways, I mean, over the last 25 years, computer graphics has advanced hugely, and so more and more you're not just combining different photographic elements, but you're also combining real elements with completely computer-generated stuff. And this is an early example, of course, from Jurassic Park, where the two dinosaurs are computer graphics and the rest of the scene is real. Actually, I don't know about the shadow there, whether that is real or not. That might have been somebody holding a stand-in object to cast the shadow. Now, just as in the past, people produce photo composites or otherwise manipulated photos just as standalone works of art, taking on the role from just like the paintings to just for something like a quick laugh. And The Onion is famous for doing manipulated photographs. Let me talk a little bit about, so I have about 10, 20 minutes? Okay. Should be done before then. So let me talk about some photography techniques. So of course, there's a huge variety of things that you could do to alter a picture, to make a new one from nothing. And so I can just present a few examples. There's no way I can tell you about everything that's possible. Anyways, so one of the easiest ways to change the look of an image is using long exposures, from seconds to hours. And well, Jesse has of course covered a bunch of that stuff, so hopefully I'm not repeating too much. So well, a few seconds of exposure turns water into something that looks somewhere between smoke and silk. Couple of hours of exposures, like in this picture here, shows you simultaneously star trails and also the trails of a bunch of airplanes coming into an SFO and leaving the airport. So in many cases, you want to take a long exposure and it's not dark enough, unless you're far away from all city lights. So there's a handy thing you can use, a neutral density filter, which is just a gray piece of glass that blocks most of the light, but without altering the color. If you don't have a neutral density filter, then well, you can take a number of pictures with shorter exposures and then combine them. Which is probably what has been done here. So if you look at the light trails for the airplanes, they all have little gaps at pretty regular intervals. So that's how he got to what must have been a 3 or 4 hour exposure, judging from the length of these arcs here. So there's no way Silicon Valley is that dark then. And if he had used a neutral density filter to do this, probably the airplane trails might have come out very dim. So now, if you are shooting pictures with long exposures, if the exposure time is long enough, you don't have to take the scene as is. You can walk in and change it. And well, we didn't talk to each other, I guess. And Jesse showed you an example of it earlier. So you can take a flashlight, as was done here with this in the building, and light it up, walk into it and around it. So as the nice thing about this is you can walk right into the picture and you will not show up as long as you're not between the camera and whatever you're currently you're shining your flashlight on, and as long as you don't point the flashlight at the camera. So here you get a blue light on the front of the boat and lighting from a couple of other places on a couple of other places in the boat where, well, I was standing. Well, you would see me in a shorter exposure, but it was dark enough and the exposure time long enough that you don't see it. Of course, you can point the light at the camera and create drawings just by waving your light around. So I don't know how this picture was done, but I assume that the white lines were just done using an LED flashlight, and those green leafy shapes were probably done by waving a piece of electroluminescent wire around and just sweeping out these scenes. Electroluminescent wire is just this stuff that looks like a wire, but you hook it up to a battery and it glows, and it comes in different colors and is not super expensive. So this kind of light painting doesn't require a whole lot of equipment. You need an interesting place that you want to light up, and a tripod, and a flashlight, and ideally a couple of color filters. But if you don't want to use color filters, you can also just use a white flashlight, take multiple exposures, and then one for each color light that you want in your final image, and then later combine these exposures in Photoshop. And that was in fact done with the boat that you saw earlier. I didn't have a red flashlight and a blue flashlight and a white one. This was just one white flashlight and multiple exposures, and then each exposure was filtered to have a particular color, and then the exposures were just all added up. So now here's another variation of light painting. So if you can use a laptop screen, wave it around in your scene, and play a movie of, say, with the cross sections of some solid objects, one after another, and then you get a volume rendering of your object that floats in midair. And so this was how this was done. This is a somewhat macabre example because this is an actual dead body. So there's about a decade ago, there was this project, The Visible Human, where a human cadaver was frozen and sliced into 1 millimeter thick slices, and every slice was photographed, and the data set is available. It's actually available as a video on YouTube that I think was played just on a laptop computer while the photographer just waved it through the scene. And so there you have this person. Salman, you?
Question on the previous one, how is the regular pattern achieved?
I don't know. That is not a picture that I took.
Okay.
My assumption is that the photographer used a stick with some LEDs attached to it in a few places, and just turned around like that. That's a guess.
Or projected it through
Yeah, or something like that. I mean, the endless variations that So one variation on long exposure is slit scan, so where not the entire image is exposed at the same time. You have a narrow slit-shaped aperture that you move across the frame over the course of a few seconds. So one end of the frame shows the world as it was a few seconds earlier than the other end of the frame. So for anything that doesn't move, you won't see any difference. It just looks like a regular exposure. But if anything moves, then it of course gets strongly distorted. So this person, I think, was just sitting on a box, the person on the left, and the box was slowly rotated while the scan went from top to bottom. On the other slide, the scan went sideways, and the person in that leopard suit probably just did some interesting dance here. The results are kind of hard to predict when you do this. It requires some trial and error. So with film, slit scan photography is usually implemented by having an actual mechanical slit that gets moved. So that the slit needs to be very narrow to get sharp results. and it needs to move with perfectly constant speed, because any variation in the speed of the slit shows up as a change in brightness, because it's an exposure variation. So that requires a special camera or a custom modification to a regular still camera, but in any case it's pretty expensive. So with if you have video though, you can just take one row or column of pixels from successive frames and assemble those into a picture, into a coherent picture. So take row 1 from frame 1, row 2 from frame 2, and so on. And that sort of works. You need a fairly high frame rate. Otherwise, a complete scan from top to bottom takes a long time. Unfortunately, most of the affordable video cameras that take high frame rate video have also fairly low resolution, but you can do something. So the lower picture that shows you what happens to your camera if you leave it in a hot car in the summer. Well, I did that with an iPhone 6 and an app that does this slit scan stuff, and it only takes a few seconds. Just put the camera on a table and wave the iPhone around this in an arc. The upper image here, much higher quality. If you look at it on a high resolution monitor, that was done with a dedicated slit scan camera, but an electronic one that had just a linear sensor that I think scans only one row of pixels, but a very high frame rate, thousands of frames per second. So of course you can go the other way, go to very short exposures, and you get interesting misinterpretations. You get the viewer to misinterpret a scene if you set it up properly. So this woman here, of course, didn't levitate. She just jumped as high as she could, but the ground is carefully cropped out of the picture, and the distant background is cleverly selected so to make it look like she's floating fairly high up. So this is also the result of a short exposure. So it's not immediately obvious, but this is a picture of a flame. So I took this, and what I did was fill a pump spray bottle like what you would use for misting plants, just filled it with kerosene and sprayed the kerosene into the flame of a blowtorch. So kerosene burns up really brightly, gives a bright puff of flame. In real life, all you see is a bright flash and really nothing else. So with a short exposure, you already get something that's pretty unnatural looking. But you get to see a lot of detail that you really cannot see with the naked eye. Well, you can see my hand here in the picture, and then just shifting the white balance to make the flame sort of this gray and brown gives you this rather weird-looking object. So, there are many trick photos that you can create by setting up a scene and photographing it, and you get the final trick photo, almost the final trick photo in the camera. So here we have a flame that looks like it's coming out of my daughter's thumb, and of course this was just done by having a candle on one side of a piece of glass, actually a glass cabinet door, and her holding her thumb on the other side. And then I took this picture with just a cell phone, with the cell phone positioned somewhere between the two to block out the reflection of that bright wax at the top of the candle. So the scene actually looked like in the left photo, except you would never mistake it for. You would never interpret it the way you would interpret the photo. So here's an example from a movie. So this looks like it's an elaborate composite picture, but it isn't. It's forced perspective. This was shot in camera as is. Forced perspective, according to Wikipedia, let me read it, is a technique which employs optical illusion to make an object appear farther away, closer, larger, or smaller than it actually is. It manipulates human visual perception through the use of scaled objects and the correlation between them, and the vantage point of the spectator or camera. So here you can see how this was done. So the landscape in the back is a large print of an actual place in Norway. The foreground is cardboard that's covered with a mixture of flour and ground glass to give to look like snow. And well, you can see how big the models are. And the ground has a bunch of holes in it so that the animators can pop out of it after every frame and move the puppets a little bit further. And these little rods here are for measuring to make sure that you can move them the same distance on every frame. And then, well, everybody hides back down under the table. You take another picture, and on you go. And of course, in the movie, this is surrounded by other shots, different angles, and people reacting to it, and it all arranges rather nicely to make you think these machines are huge, at least hundreds of feet tall. Now, force perspective doesn't have to be nearly as elaborate. So there are plenty of things you can do very easily with very little equipment, and sometimes force perspective shots even happen accidentally. That baboon here probably just happened to be sitting on the windshield of the car that the picture was shot out of. So, well, this is, of course, nobody got beheaded here. Just there's one guy hiding behind the sofa, and the other guy is just leaning his head back. So she isn't really standing on a very tall cliff. This photo is just turned upside down. But probably, oh, how much time do I have? I'm almost 5 minutes? Okay. So probably the most versatile technique for creating trick photographs is photomontage, because you can make fantasy creatures like that proboscis bird there, or a completely fantastic landscape, or just a family picture where nobody is blinking and none of the kids are picking their nose. And so some of these pictures can be extremely elaborate. So this is actually a montage of probably a couple of hundred shots. So this photographer, that's his thing that he does. So he hires very patient models and pours milk over them, splashes from different directions and tosses the milk, and with careful planning, of course, to make sure that he gets all the pieces that he needs for a dress. And then he's also very patient and assembles all this into a coherent picture. Of course, you could never pour milk so that this would happen and all at once. So photomontages you can make using photochemical processes, and you had earlier I showed, of course, some examples. Black and white is something you could do in an amateur darkroom, but color is a lot harder. But nowadays we have digital cameras and we have software like Photoshop, and that makes these things a lot easier. So Photoshop, well, probably all of you know this, and similar software, you make composites by stacking a bunch of layers. Each layer has a matte that, where it's white, the layer is opaque. Where it's black, it's transparent, and you can independently manipulate the layers and the mattes. And so to make a composite, all you have to do is find the right elements or shoot them, stack them in the right ways you want, and then there's your final image. So of course it helps to shoot the elements with the final composite in mind. I mean, Photoshop has a lot of tools that allows you that allow you to combine images that weren't meant to be combined into your final composite in the first place. But if you know what you want, you can shoot. So these are, of course, the elements that went into the picture I showed you before. So by shooting them right, you can make sure that the lighting and the perspective are consistent, and the final compositing becomes a lot easier. So there's still some retouching that needed to be done. I mean, this is the corner of the phone. So in one of the photos, you can clearly see that I just stacked an iPhone on top of a Swiss Army knife, right? And then, but after some retouching, removing or adjusting the reflections and shadows, now the knife blade and the scissor thing, they look like they actually sit in a slot in the foam. So, well, actually, I'm almost done. So I'll show you only one more composite, a really simple one. But again, it helps to shoot the elements that knowing what you want. So here, I wanted to make sure that this looks like my son's actually floating above that picnic table, and not that this doesn't look like a photo of a person pasted on top of a photo of a picnic table. So I needed to establish the three-dimensional position of him. So I had him hold a piece of string that goes down to the table and is clearly in contact with the table, and you can tell people it's so that the wind doesn't blow him away. And you also need a shadow under him, so that gives you, those are hints that tell you where he is. So shooting this was actually quite easy. So he sits on a stool here. Then we shoot a separate picture with just the shadow. Well, it doesn't have to be him. A piece of newspaper is enough. And then there was also one more shot that I don't have here, where you just have the clear background, so that he can fill in, so that the final composite is possible. So, well, anyways, this is something that is easy to do, and you probably should try out various of these techniques. Yeah, that's about all I have, and, well, thank you.